Okay, welcome to this special edition video. As I promised, I wanted to make one shorter video on the Dunciad because partly because that is one of my favorite texts, certainly one of my favorite texts from the 18th century. And it's a very central text to understanding the 18th century, but at the same time, it is, for several reasons that I will try to explain, highly inaccessible. So if you start reading it, you'll probably think, first of all, you won't know even where to start and where to continue reading it, and most of the allusions will get lost. So I want to use this here as a way to at least introduce you to some of the features of that really very fascinating text. Now we're doing that in the context of the debate about the literary market, the literary world in the 18th century. And I mentioned the fact that the commercialization of the book market brought with it this notion of the hack writer, of a writer who just writes for money, and that there is actually even sort of a whole subculture that is associated with that. And that was encapsulated in this notion of Grub Street. So writers like Pope, who really were seen as the epitome of poetic achievement in their own time, were looking suspiciously at these new writers. This is one thing. But then on the other hand, because of Pope's prominence, because he was seen as the foremost poet of the age, and because it was an age of satire, of debate, which is sometimes civilized, but also sometimes very vicious and vitriolic, because of that, he was also attacked most often. So basically, it was a little bit like whenever Donald Trump tweets something, you immediately get 3,000 replies to that, and a lot of that is, of course, sort of a counterweight to that. So that's basically what happened whenever Pope would publish something. He would get attacked for whatever he wrote. He would get attacked for his opinions and for several other things. Among them, his Catholicism, that this was always an easy target, but also the fact that he had, from birth, he had a disease, tuberculosis of the spine, which meant that he had a deformed back and was very small. So yeah, I'm just going to give you one example of such attacks. This is a sort of a pamphlet attack, and you see here that there's a sort of this pedestal to His Holiness and his prime minister, and that depicts Pope as a monkey with a Pope with a tiara of the Pope. So it manages to make fun of his religion and his body at the same time. So these were the kinds of attacks that Pope had to deal with day in and day out. And for many years, he kept his cool, seemingly unfazed by all of these attacks. There's this anecdote that he actually had. He collected all the pamphlets and books that were written against him, all the attacks, and he had them bound by a bookbinder, and had sort of his shelf that was reserved for attacks on himself. But as we can see, there was also an ulterior motive to this collecting of all of the attacks, because when he finally, in 1728, published his reaction to all of the criticism and his full-scale counterattack on all the bad critics, on all his opponents, he made sure to include this here. And you see this is a list of books, papers, and verses in which our author was abused before the publication of the Dunciad, with the true names of the authors. So Pope makes sure to say, okay, I wasn't the first. You started that fight, but you sure didn't know what you were getting into. And then he gives us the Dunciad. So with the Dunciad, he publishes a poem that makes fun of all of his literary enemies at once, and addressed what he saw as wrong with the culture of his time. It is modeled on a poem that I have also introduced, John Dryden's poem Macflecknoe, which had this basic premise of the king of bad poets has died, and now we need to find a successor to the kings of bad poets. And he basically does the same thing. It is about the crowning of the king of dunces, and dunce is another word for fool, for idiot. So we're looking for the greatest fool in the country, and he's going to be crowned by the goddess Dullness. And this is, of course, a full-scale attack on Grub Street, and the kind of writing that emerged from that. We can take a look at one of the examples here, where he describes sort of the scene. One cell there is in these sort of dungeon-like spaces. One cell there is concealed from vulgar eye, the cave of poverty and poetry. So this is poetry that comes out of poverty. This is the distressed poet that has no money. Keen, hollow winds howl through the bleak recess, emblem of music caused by emptiness. Hence, from hence, bards like Proteus long in vain tied down, escape in monsters and amaze the town. So this is sort of a figurative description of where all the bad poetry comes from. The mode of the Dunciad is also that of the mock heroic, like Pope's earlier Rape of the Lock, and is probably the most extreme and well-known example of the mock heroic. So here again we have very, very stupid characters and events that are nevertheless described as if they were stuff of the ancient epic poets, the ancient heroes and gods and goddesses. And Pope models his poem on very much on these epic poems, with all the trappings, trips to the underworld, but also the heroic games that are being proposed by the goddess Dullness in order to honor the king of dunces that is being crowned. And now the queen, this is Dullness, to glad her sons proclaims by herald hawkers high heroic games. They summon all her race, an endless band pours forth and leaves unpeopled half the land. And here we can already see sort of the scope of the attack that Pope does. This isn't just about one person or a number of persons, but really it's basically a whole sort of culture that is being indicted. A motley mixture in long wigs, in bags, in silks, in crapes, in garters, and in rags, from drawing rooms, from colleges, from garrets, on horse, on foot, in hacks and gilded chariots, all who true dunces in her cause appeared, and all who knew those dunces to reward. So that's another snipe at the patronage system, those who reward those dunces just because they flatter them. But then in the very spirit of the mock heroic, we find out soon enough that these games aren't the normal games of wrestling, running, throwing javelins or things like that. So for example, there's a mud diving contest, and one of the contests that is being proposed is actually a pissing contest. And the goddess then, who best can send on high the salient spout, far streaming to the sky, his beyond Juno of majestic size, this is the prize for the first one, with cow-like udders and with ox-like eyes. This China Jordan let the chief overcome, replenish, not ingloriously, at home. So pissing contest, and the first prize is this Juno of majestic size, which is Eliza Haywood, one of the very popular and very successful writers of early novels. So this is a contest for the publishers. So they vie for this very lucrative author, and the second prize is this China Jordan, so a chamber pot, which can then be filled. Osborne and Curl, those are two notorious publishers and intimate enemies of Pope. Osborne and Curl accept the glorious strife, though this his son dissuades and that his wife. One on his manly confidence relies, one on his vigor and superior size. First, Osborne leaned against his lettered post. It rose and labored to a curve at most. A second effort brought but new disgrace. The wild meander washed the artist's face. Not so from shameless Curl. Impetuous spread the stream, and smoking flourished o'er his head. Through half the heavens he pours the exalted urn, his rapid waters in their passage burn. So we see nicely how this very high-flown language is used to describe something as low as this, while also, of course, in the last line implying that Curl suffers from syphilis, most likely, because that would make urination burn, and he would feel that. So this is the main text of the Dunciad, this poem, this mock heroic poem that describes all these characters, makes fun in an incredibly bawdy and ludicrous way. Which is great if you know who we are talking about. So I could tell you a lot about Edmund Curl, the bookseller, and then so many of the things that are being told about him start making sense. But that is something that is, of course, that kind of distances us from an easy reading of the text. But that's not everything. Now, he published his first 3 books of this, and basically made fun of everyone, and obviously the backlash against this was then enormous, and there was a lot of attacks. He had published, in the original version, he had published the names all just with initials, and immediately after the Dunciad came out, publishers like Edmund Curl actually published so-called keys, where they would actually say, okay, this character, these initials are this bookseller or this writer or this poet and novelist and so on, so that you know exactly who is meant by whom. So there's a lot of things going on and debate about the Dunciad. So 1728, the first Dunciad, and this is when it gets complicated, even in a sense of which text am I actually reading? Partly because there are many different editions. So this is the first one, and then in the next year, Pope published what he called the Dunciad Variorum, and in this, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. He included a lot of the material that was used to attack him on occasion of the Dunciad. And then a couple of years later, he actually wrote a 4th book of the Dunciad, so kind of a sequel. And then 1 year again later, he published the whole thing once more in 4 books with all the Variorum parts. And I want to talk about this a little bit. So what he did is around the poem, which is still sort of the center of the text, he gathers all of this material that is kind of like a mock scholarly apparatus, where you have all of the things that you would have in a kind of scholarly edition of a classical text, and all of this is of course fake. So here you see the table of contents of the original Variorum edition, and you can see that it has lots of material. It has the publisher's advertisement. There is a letter to the publisher occasioned by the present edition of the Dunciad, which is made up. There is the prolegomena, so it's another kind of preface of Martin Scriblerus, and Martin Scriblerus doesn't exist. He is a sort of a made-up idea of a bad scholar, a bad literary scholar. Then there is testimonies of authors concerning our poet and his work, and this is where Pope starts to work in the a lot of the attacks on himself. There is another dissertation on the poet, on the poem, and the argument of the book and the Dunciad. But then there's an index of persons that are celebrated in this poem. So he includes also the key that had been published, index of things, and so on and so forth. And there's much more than that. So there's this, it gets blown up with this additional material. But not only that, because it also gets footnotes, and in the footnotes, again, this is sort of mock scholarly, making fun of the way that literary scholars would write footnotes and annotations to classical texts. So here we have these completely made up footnotes, but they're not completely made up. They are actually sort of a mixture between stuff that Pope makes up and quotes from actual texts that actually had commented on the Dunciad. So this is where it really gets sort of proto-postmodern-y in that this becomes sort of a hypertext of one poem that is then commented on by a text that is this strange mixture of made up quotes, real quotes, and made up comments. And this is huge. So I wanted to show you this. This is the first page of the poem itself. Right, you see here the Dunciad. It's dedicated to Swift. This is the first book, and then we have the first two lines. These are the first two lines here, and after that there's remarks, because I mean, the remarks are actually already about the title, Dunciad. The first footnote is about the title. So we only have these two lines, and then already the remarks start. But then if you go to the next page, we see there is another two lines, and then the remarks have basically swallowed the whole page. And even on the third page, again, two lines, and all of the rest is remarks by different made-up authors. So we have this text that is sort of buried in its own remarks, and it doesn't go on like that through all of the poem, but definitely the remarks are more text than the text itself. But they're, of course, the annotation, they're of course not helpful in any way for us as modern readers, because they would need their own annotations as well. So all of these are reasons why it's very, very difficult to sort of get a grip of the whole of the Dunciad. If you do, you will have basically mastered the literary landscape in mid-18th century England, or you can just take snippets and enjoy the kind of satirical fun that Pope plays on his literary enemies. And this is from the end. This is just to show how similar to Swift's Gulliver's Travels, which also sort of started with very particular satire and then gradually increased the range of what he was making fun of until he basically had all of humanity. So Pope's, in a similar way, starts by making fun of specific authors, but then particularly in the fourth book, broadens that to basically a vision of the end of all culture, the downfall of all culture. And this is these are the final lines that show sort of the ultimate emergence of dullness and the reign of dullness and stupidity and chaos over all of the land. In vain the all-composing hour resistless falls, the muse obeys the power. She comes, this is dullness, she comes, the sable throne behold of night primeval and of chaos old. Before her fancy's gilded clouds decay, and all its varying rainbows die away. Wit shoots in vain its momentary fires, the meteor drops and in a flash expires. As Argus' eyes by Hermes' wand oppressed close one by one to everlasting rest, thus at her felt approach and secret might, art after art goes out and all is night. See, skulking truth to her old cavern fled, mountains of casuistry heaped over her head. Philosophy, that leaned on heaven before, shrinks to her second cause and is no more. Physic of metaphysics beckons defense, and metaphysics calls for aid on sense. See mystery to mathematics fly, in vain they gaze, turn giddy, rave, and die. Religion, blushing, veils her sacred fires, and unawares morality expires. Nor public flame, nor private dares to shine, nor human spark is left, nor glimpse divine. Lo, thy dread empire chaos is restored, light dies before thy uncreating word. Thy hand, great anarch, lets the curtain fall, and universal darkness buries all. And in this we of course have sort of a reverse Genesis. It's almost like the unmaking of the universe. Light dies before thy uncreating word. Remember how Genesis, in the beginning there was the word, and the word was let there be light. And that of course is also sort of a symbol for the Enlightenment, for this gradual spreading of the light. So here we have kind of the counter vision to that, the vision that all of that might be lost in a way in commercialization, or just in a loss of standards. So Pope here gives us this counter vision of the Enlightenment, where universal darkness in the end buries all.